The PMP exam is going to test you extensively on how to prioritize project risks using qualitative risk analysis. You have probably read the relevant chapter in the Project Management Body of Knowledge Guide, and the core concept feels straightforward on paper. However, here is where students who understand the definitions still get tripped up during the actual test. I once spent days logging minor daily operational risks while completely overlooking a rare threat on a hospital build that eventually materialized and halted our entire foundation work. PM Panda here, PMP certified since 2003 with 2.5 decades in delivery, and the trap I am about to show you is one I have watched derail good managers and one that tripped me up on my first PMP attempt. Misunderstanding this tool does more than just hurt your exam score because in a real project environment, the consequences land directly on your shoulders. Senior executives do not care that a catastrophic event was statistically improbable when a major deliverable is completely ruined and you have no response strategy prepared. I experienced this firsthand during an infrastructure build when an ignored 1% weather risk destroyed our concrete foundation and cost weeks of rework. Standing in front of a steering committee to explain that the math predicted the event was unlikely does not save your project baseline from a massive hit. To protect your project, you must master qualitative risk analysis, which is the official process of prioritizing individual project risks for further action by assessing their probability of occurrence and impact. In plain English, you are figuring out how likely a bullet is to fire and how deep it will penetrate if it hits your project. The tool we use for this in the 8th edition of the PMBOK Guide Underperform Risk Analysis is the Probability and Impact Matrix. This matrix is a data representation grid that maps the likelihood of each risk occurring against its impact on objectives like cost, time, scope, or quality. In plain English, it is a heat map that forces you to visually rank what will hurt your project the most, typically using a 5x5 scoring scheme from very low to very high. I used a 5x5 matrix when a major software deployment flagged a severe compliance failure, allowing us to pivot before deployment. This helps us avoid the severity outlier trap, where a risk with a very low probability under 10% but a very high impact is mistakenly ignored. In plain English, you never turn your back on a fatal threat even if it rarely happens, much like a 1% flood probability that once wiped out an entire construction site I managed. Before we examine the financial calculations, try looking at your current project and thinking about the single worst thing that could happen to your deliverables. It does not need to be a highly likely event, but just consider whether your current risk log treats that massive impact with the visibility it actually deserves. The upcoming section details the specific scoring methodology the PMP exam uses to evaluate your situational judgment, separating well-prepared candidates from those who merely memorize definitions. Let us set up a scenario identical to what you might encounter on an exam question or during a real-world project review. Imagine you are managing a large-scale international hospital construction build with a total planned value budget of $5 million. During planning, your engineering team identifies a rare risk of hitting an uncharted underground water spring during excavation. Because the historical geological data shows this is incredibly rare, the team assesses the probability at just 1%, which is represented mathematically as 0.01. However, if you actually hit that spring, the absolute financial impact to remediate the foundation will consume your entire $5 million budget. Here is the math line by line so you can follow exactly what happens on the exam. Expected monetary value equals probability multiplied by impact. That gives us 0.01 multiplied by 5 million, which equals $50,000. On the surface, that looks manageable, and that is precisely the trap. The exam will present this scenario and ask you how to classify this risk on the probability and impact matrix. The correct answer is B. Classify it as high priority, because the absolute impact of $5 million represents a project-ending severity outlier. The probability and impact matrix requires you to treat catastrophic impacts as critical, regardless of how small the EMV calculation looks. Trusting the $50,000 average instead of the $5 million reality is what sinks the foundation and ends the project. Here's what I see project managers get wrong most often when analyzing risks, and I made the first mistake myself early in my career by treating the matrix as a purely mathematical multiplication game. Junior managers blindly multiply the low probability by the high impact score and assume a low product means the risk is completely safe to ignore. Another frequent error is confusing a reactive contingency plan with a proactive risk response, forgetting that severe threats require active avoidance or mitigation regardless of how low the probability seems. On the PMP exam, test makers will constantly try to trick you by presenting a 1% probability risk with a catastrophic impact, hoping you will choose the multiple choice option to simply accept the risk. To avoid this trap in my current projects, I implement a strict two-step validation process within our project risk management framework. Step 1 requires mapping every single identified threat onto a 5x5 probability and impact matrix to isolate high-severity outliers, regardless of their statistical probability. Step 2 dictates that any risk falling into the highest impact column must have a dedicated risk response strategy documented in the risk register and escalated directly to the project sponsor. This ensures that fatal project threats are never hidden behind low percentage averages or lost in a massive spreadsheet. For your professional certification exams, always remember that qualitative risk analysis is a subjective, qualitative evaluation that must occur before quantitative modeling. The exam often presents scenarios where a project manager is overwhelmed by a long list of newly identified risks and asks what the practitioner should do next. Real-world instinct might drive you to start calculating exact dollar amounts or calling vendors for quotes right away. However, the correct PMBOK answer choice will always direct you to prioritize those risks first using a qualitative tool like the probability and impact matrix. Question 1. A project manager is reviewing a risk log containing 50 identified threats and needs to prioritize them for further analysis. A team member suggests calculating the exact monetary value for every risk immediately to save time. What should the project manager do first? A. Accept the suggestion and multiply probability by value for all risks. B. Perform a qualitative risk analysis using a probability and impact matrix. C. Escalate the entire risk log to the project sponsor for prioritization. D. Create a fallback plan for the top 10 highest probability risks. Correct answer, B. Qualitative analysis must be performed first to prioritize risks before investing time in detailed quantitative calculations. Common trap. A is tempting because it sounds rigorous, but performing quantitative calculations on 50 risks without prioritizing them first is an inefficient use of resources. Question 2. During an international hospital build with a $5 million budget, a risk is identified with a 1% probability of occurring, but it carries an absolute impact of $5 million. The expected monetary value is calculated at $50,000. How should this risk be classified on the probability and impact matrix? A. Low priority because the expected monetary value is minimal. B. High priority because the absolute impact represents a severe project outlier. C. Medium priority because the probability and impact averages balance out. D. Low priority because a 1% probability is statistically insignificant. Correct answer, B. High-impact risks must be prioritized as severe outliers even if their probability of occurrence is very low. Common trap. A is the classic mathematical trap where candidates rely entirely on the low expected monetary value instead of evaluating absolute severity. Question 3. A project manager has identified a regulatory change risk that has a very low probability of happening but would completely invalidate the project deliverables if it occurs. The project manager decides to take no action because the event is highly unlikely. What mistake was made according to risk management best practices? A. Failing to calculate the precise variance coefficient. B. Confusing risk identification with risk response implementation. C. Ignoring a high-severity outlier due to its low probability. D. Failing to update the project schedule baseline. Correct answer, C. Practitioners often let low likelihood blind them to catastrophic impacts, which violates the core purpose of a qualitative matrix. Common trap. B sounds highly professional, but the core failure here is the analytical mistake of ignoring severity during the evaluation phase. I truly wish someone had sat me down and explained the hidden danger of averaging out severe impacts when I was studying for my own exam years ago. To make sure this concept sticks, open your risk register today and review how your team is evaluating low-probability, high-impact threats. If this breakdown helped clarify the qualitative risk process for you, please hit the like button and subscribe to receive one real-world practitioner lesson every single week. Take 10 minutes right now to ensure your high-severity outliers are properly visualized so you can keep your baseline fully protected.